Lyle and Eric Menendez. In August of 1989, inside a Mediterranean mansion at 722 North Elm Drive in Beverly Hills, two of the most privileged young men in California ended the lives of their own parents. Jose Menendez was a feared entertainment executive. His wife, Kitty, was beside him in the den. The brothers, Lyle and Eric, then in their late teens and early 20s, used shotguns, and they reloaded before the night was over. The estate left behind was valued at roughly $14 million, a fortune the brothers expected to share. The shotguns used that night had been bought days earlier on a trip to San Diego. At first, police suspected a professional hit. Jose had built a ruthless reputation in business and had no shortage of enemies, and the scene looked almost staged to send a message. But there were no signs of forced entry, and the focus slowly narrowed toward the two people who stood to gain the most from the deaths. What turned suspicion into certainty was money. In the months that followed, the brothers spent close to $700,000, much of it drawn from their father's $650,000 life insurance policy. There was a Porsche worth $64,000. There were 3 Rolex watches, bought only days after the funeral. There was a restaurant in Princeton, private tennis coaching, and a wardrobe to match. The mansion itself, close to 9,000 square feet and purchased only the year before, had been a picture of success. Does grief usually go shopping? Investigators kept watching. But the real break came from an unexpected place. Eric confessed to his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel, during a session in the autumn of 1989. Oziel recorded parts of these conversations. When his mistress, Judalon Smith, went to police about the existence of the tapes, the case finally cracked open. In March of 1990, both brothers were arrested. The path through the courts was long. The first trials, held in the early 1990s, gave each brother his own jury, and both panels deadlocked, unable to agree on whether the killings were murder or something less. A second trial, in the mid-1990s, one that placed tighter limits on what the defense could present, reached a verdict that convicted both Lyle and Eric of first-degree murder. In 1996, they were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For decades, that seemed to be the end. Then the case roared back to life. In 2023, the brothers filed a petition pointing to new claims about their treatment as young men at home, including an old letter Eric had written to a cousin and statements from a former entertainer who described the household. It was material their original juries never fully weighed. The question returned to the public. Were these cold, calculating heirs, or frightened sons who believed they had no other way out? In 2024, the Los Angeles District Attorney at the time recommended they be resentenced, while his successor opposed it. The legal tug-of-war reached a peak in May of 2025, when a judge resentenced the brothers to 50 years to life, a change that finally made them eligible to seek parole under laws covering people who commit crimes when young. Freedom, though, did not follow. In August of 2025, both brothers went before a parole board, and both were denied release, with officials pointing to rule violations behind bars. Weeks later, a judge rejected their bid for a new trial, finding the fresh evidence unconvincing. So where do they stand now? As of the middle of 2026, both remain locked up in the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego County, housed at the same prison for the first time in decades. A clemency petition remains pending with the governor, who left the brothers out of a round of clemency grants announced in February of 2026. Their next realistic opportunity is an administrative parole review expected later in the year, one that could lead to a fresh hearing as soon as the following year, provided they avoid further rule violations behind bars. But the next case would not play out over months of quiet suspicion. It would unfold across a single, terrifying stretch of hours, inside a home where wealth was supposed to mean safety. Darren Wint. In the spring of 2015, a $4.5 million mansion in one of Washington's most exclusive neighborhoods became the scene of a hostage ordeal that ended in fire. Inside the home on Woodland Drive, in the Woodley Park area near Massachusetts Avenue, lived Sava Savopoulos, the chief executive of a major construction firm, his wife Amy, their son, and the family's housekeeper, Veralicia Figueroa. Across roughly a full day, somewhere between 18 and 24 hours, all four were held captive and then killed, and the house was set ablaze to hide what had been done. It was one of the most shocking crimes the capital had seen in years. The motive was money, demanded directly. The captor forced the family to arrange for $40,000 in cash to be delivered to the home while they were still being held. It was an enormous sum to gather in a single afternoon, and the family complied, hoping it would be enough to end the ordeal. To the outside world, nothing seemed wrong until smoke began pouring from the mansion. By the time firefighters fought their way inside, the family and their housekeeper were gone. The housekeeper had no connection to the man responsible. She was simply working at the home when the ordeal began. So how does a crime this controlled and this personal get solved? The answer came from something small and almost careless. During the long hours of the ordeal, food had been ordered to the house. A delivery of pizza arrived, and a single crust was left behind. On that crust, investigators recovered genetic material. That DNA matched Darren Wint, a former welder who had once worked for the chief executive's company years earlier. It was not the only thread. Forensic teams tied Wint to the scene through additional evidence, including traces on a knife and material recovered from a family vehicle that had been driven away from the home and burned. He had worked as a welder for the chief executive's company more than a decade earlier, a connection that helped explain how he knew the household. After the genetic match came back, police launched a manhunt and arrested him in late May of 2015, only days after the killings. How had a man with an old tie to the family ended up back in their lives so violently? The case against him built toward an unusual question. Was this the work of one man alone, or had others helped carry out something so large and so coordinated? Prosecutors focused their case on Wint, presenting the forensic links and the timeline of the ransom, while the defense pushed back on whether a single person could have controlled four captives for so long. When police moved in, Wint was taken into custody alongside several other people, but he alone was ever charged. In October of 2018, a jury delivered its decision. Darren Wint was found guilty on every count he faced, around 20 in total, including multiple counts of first-degree murder. A few months later, in early 2019, the sentence followed. Wint received 4 consecutive terms of life in prison, with no path to release. For a crime built around a demand for cash, the price he paid was the rest of his life. He did not stop fighting the outcome. On appeal, his lawyers argued that a decision to keep out a particular witness had denied him a fair hearing. But in late 2022, an appeals court upheld the conviction, calling that decision harmless and concluding that the evidence against him was overwhelming enough that any error made no difference. No new trial was granted. Other evidence reinforced the case. Investigators recovered hairs and further genetic traces and found a construction vest inside the family's vehicle after it was set on fire. The $40,000 in ransom had been dropped at the home by an assistant acting on instructions with no idea what was unfolding inside. Wint had left the construction company years before the killings, but prosecutors argued that his familiarity with the household and the property helped him hold control of it for so long. They said the ransom proved the crime was driven by money from the very first hour. The next case moves away from ransom and robbery into a world of Olympic ambition and a fortune so vast that it shaped an entire sport. John DuPont. Few American names carried as much wealth as DuPont. John DuPont was an heir to that chemical fortune, with a personal worth estimated near $150 million and an 800-acre estate in Pennsylvania that he turned into a private training ground for elite wrestlers. He called it Foxcatcher. His was a household name long before any of this. To the athletes who lived and trained there, it offered world-class facilities and a strange, unpredictable benefactor. Some saw him as a generous patron of their sport. Others sensed that something was deeply wrong. On a winter day in January of 1996, that strangeness turned deadly. John DuPont shot and killed Dave Schultz, an Olympic gold medalist from the 1984 Games and one of the most respected wrestlers in the country, who had been training on the estate as part of DuPont's own wrestling team, in the driveway of Schultz's home, firing 3 rounds, the last of them at close range. Schultz's wife witnessed the shooting from nearby. There had been no argument that made sense, no clear provocation. One of the sport's greatest figures was simply gone. Why would a man with everything turn on the athlete he had supported? The answer lay in DuPont's mind. For years, his behavior had grown more erratic and more paranoid. He had come to believe he was the target of vast conspiracies, and at times claimed to be figures far beyond himself. By the time of the shooting, the line between his suspicions and reality had all but vanished. Those around him had noticed the decline, but his money insulated him from the kind of intervention an ordinary person might have faced. After the shooting, DuPont locked himself inside his mansion. What followed was a tense standoff that stretched across 2 days, with police surrounding the grounds while negotiators tried to coax him out. He was finally captured when officers cut the heat to his home in the dead of winter, and he stepped outside into the cold to check on it. The trial that followed was not about whether he had fired the shots. That was never seriously in doubt. The real fight was over his mind. Was he a killer who understood exactly what he had done, or a man so ill that he could not grasp it? In February of 1997, the jury reached a careful middle ground. DuPont was found guilty of third-degree murder, but mentally ill, a verdict under state law that acknowledged both his responsibility and his condition at once. The judge sentenced him to a term of 13 to 30 years, sending him to a secure facility for treatment rather than letting him walk free, an outcome that satisfied almost no one completely. For the Schultz family, the verdict could never restore what was taken. Dave Schultz had been a mentor, a husband, and a champion who lifted others around him. His death cast a long shadow over American wrestling and over every athlete who had trusted the estate's promise of support. Many of them packed up and left Foxcatcher for good. DuPont's story did not end with a release. He died behind bars in December of 2010, at the age of 72, of natural causes, inside a state correctional facility in western Pennsylvania. He holds a grim distinction as the only member of the published list of richest Americans ever convicted of a killing. Years later, his story reached a wide audience through the film Foxcatcher, which explored the unsettling pull between his wealth and his unraveling mind. DuPont had funded American wrestling for years, turning his estate into a training base for Olympic hopefuls and lending his name and money to the sport. In the months before the killing, his conduct had alarmed those around him. He spoke of hidden enemies and intruders, and had begun forcing people off his property. Some who had trained there left well before that winter, uneasy about what they saw. By then, the national wrestling body had already begun stepping back from him. He had no criminal record before that January morning, and the warnings went unheeded until Dave Schultz was dead. The next case trades the quiet of a country estate for the glamour of the Hamptons, and a fortune tangled in a bitter divorce. Daniel Pelosi. In the autumn of 2001, in the moneyed calm of East Hampton, New York, a Wall Street financier named Ted Ammon was found dead in the bedroom of his summer mansion on Middle Lane, one of the most expensive streets in the Hamptons. Ammon was enormously successful, with an estate valued near $97 million and homes that signaled his place at the top of the financial world. His death, in a house worth several million on its own, would expose how an empire of money can collapse into something far darker. Ammon had been worth a fortune in life. In death, that fortune did not protect him at all. At the time he died, Ammon was in the middle of a bitter divorce from his wife, Generosa. The marriage had dissolved into open hostility, and Generosa had already moved on with another man, an electrician named Daniel Pelosi. Pelosi had first come into the family's orbit doing electrical work on their homes, and his relationship with Generosa grew from there. Ammon was killed in his bed, and there were no signs that a stranger had broken in. His body was discovered by an associate who came to check on him after he failed to appear as expected. From the start, investigators believed the answer lived inside that broken marriage rather than outside it. The motive was written into the timing. Because the divorce had not been finalized, and because Ammon had not changed his will, his estranged wife stood to inherit the fortune rather than lose half of it in a settlement. The divorce had turned vicious, with the couple battling over money and the future of their household. And a settlement was close when Ammon died. Generosa inherited the bulk of the estate instead of splitting it in the divorce, and within months, in early 2002, she married Pelosi, who benefited most from the financier's death. And how quickly did they move? The case, however, did not unfold fast. Generosa's own story took a tragic turn when she fell ill and died of cancer in 2003, before any charges were brought against her. That left Pelosi as the central figure, the man who had stepped into Ammon's wealth and his widow's life almost at once. If the person who gained the most was already gone, who would answer for the death itself? Prosecutors argued that Pelosi had killed Ammon to secure the lavish lifestyle the inheritance offered. They built a case around his connections, his access, and his behavior in the aftermath, leaning on circumstantial evidence rather than any confession. Witnesses described his sudden comfort with Ammon's money and the lifestyle that came with marrying into the estate, and prosecutors framed him as the man with the most to gain from the death. The defense countered that others were responsible, and Pelosi himself pointed fingers elsewhere, including at Generosa and an associate named Christopher Parino, insisting he was being framed for something he did not do. In December of 2004, a jury sided with the prosecution. Daniel Pelosi was convicted of second-degree murder. Early the next year, in 2005, he was sentenced to 25 years to life. He also pleaded guilty to tampering with witnesses, an act that spoke to how far he had gone to control the story around Ammon's death, and that handed prosecutors a clear window into his conduct after the killing. Even after the verdict, Pelosi never accepted it. He has continued to maintain his innocence, and his appeals have been turned away by the courts. Under the terms of his sentence, he becomes eligible to seek parole in the year 2031, though eligibility is a long way from release. and his appeals so far have gone nowhere. The investigation dragged on for roughly 3 years before anyone was charged. By the time prosecutors were ready to move, Generosa was dead, and Pelosi stood alone as the only person ever charged in Ammon's death. He had married into one of the largest fortunes on Long Island, and within a few short years, he had lost both the money and his freedom. The next case leaves the coast behind and turns toward a quiet suburban street where two brothers built a business together before everything between them broke. Paul Canero. 2 days before Thanksgiving in 2018, fire crews were called to a sprawling home on Willowbrook Road in Colts Neck, New Jersey, one of the most affluent towns in the state. What they found went far beyond a house fire. In and around the property, an entire family had been killed. Keith Canero, a successful technology and pest control entrepreneur, his wife Jennifer, and their 2 children. Keith had been shot outside the house before the blaze was lit, and the home had been deliberately set on fire. On the same morning, miles away, a second fire broke out at another home, this one belonging to Keith's brother and business partner, Paul Canero, in nearby Ocean Township. Paul, along with his wife and daughters, escaped unharmed. At first, it looked as though someone might be targeting the whole family, striking at both households at once. But that early theory would not survive the investigation. Why would 2 fires, 2 homes, and 2 branches of the same family be connected? Investigators soon began to suspect that the second fire had not been an attack at all, but a smokescreen. The theory took shape that Paul had set his own home alight to make himself look like a victim, drawing suspicion away from himself. If a man would burn his own home to sell a lie, what else was he capable of? The motive pointed straight at money. The brothers shared ownership of businesses, and Paul was under severe financial strain, facing overdrafts and missed payments. Prosecutors alleged that he had been quietly draining funds tied to the family's finances, including money connected to a $3 million life insurance policy. He was months behind on what he owed, even as he controlled accounts that ran through the brothers' businesses. The day before the killings, Keith had reportedly confronted Paul about missing money. For a partnership built over years, it was the kind of accusation that could end everything. Was that confrontation the spark that set everything in motion? The forensic case against Paul grew steadily. Investigators recovered blood-stained clothing hidden in his basement, linked to the scene. They gathered further evidence, including a fuel container, ballistic findings, and surveillance footage that helped trace his movements. Piece by piece, the image of a grieving brother gave way to that of a suspect. The survivor was quietly becoming the prime suspect. The road to trial was unusually long. Years of delays followed, driven by the pandemic and by legal battles over evidence, including disputes about complex DNA analysis and a warrantless seizure of camera footage that reached all the way to the state's highest court. It was not until early 2026, more than 7 years after the fires, that Paul Canero finally faced a jury. The verdict arrived in February of 2026. Paul was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder, along with arson and theft charges. The jury rejected entirely the idea that he had been the victim of some outside plot. The man who had presented himself as a survivor was found to be the one responsible. At sentencing in May of 2026, Judge Mark Lemieux did not hold back. He described the killings as the product of cold, deliberate malice, and called Paul a calculating man who had destroyed everyone around him in a ruthless effort to preserve his own comfort. The evidence against him, the judge said, had been overwhelming. Paul received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, followed by an additional 18 years for the other crimes. The judge added that his home for the rest of his days would be a prison cell. Paul Canero has maintained his innocence and has 45 days from the sentencing to file an appeal. The brothers had co-owned a pest control company and a technology venture, and Paul handled much of the money moving through them. Investigators determined that he set the fire at his own home in the early hours of that morning, then reported it, casting himself as the second target of an attack that had never happened. It was that staged fire, the one meant to clear him, that first turned investigators toward him. He was arrested within days, charged first with the arson at his own home and then with the killings. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying these cases, take a moment to subscribe, because the stories only get stranger from here. The next case moves to the California coast, where a love affair and a fortune set the stage for a killing that would stay unsolved for years. Nanette Packard and Eric Naposki. In December of 1994, in a gated waterfront community in Newport Beach, California, a self-made millionaire named William McLaughlin was shot to death inside his own home. He was hit 6 times as he stood in his kitchen, a sudden and violent end for a man who had built a fortune through invention. McLaughlin, known to friends as Bill, was 55 and had made his money creating a medical device that separated plasma from blood, an invention that built him a fortune worth tens of millions of dollars. The home where he died sat in an exclusive gated community along the water. He shared his life and his beachfront home with a woman named Nanette Johnston, his live-in girlfriend. To Bill, she was the woman he intended to marry. What he did not know was that she was also involved with another man, a former professional football player named Eric Naposki, who had once played as a linebacker for teams including the New England Patriots and the Indianapolis Colts before drifting into work as a nightclub bouncer. Prosecutors would later say he had been given a key to the home and knew its layout well. Investigators first looked close to home and even considered Bill's own son for a time before clearing him. But the financial picture told a darker story. Nanette had quietly drained close to $500,000 from Bill's accounts through forged checks, and one check made out to her for $250,000 was dated the day before he died. She also stood to gain from a life insurance policy worth around $1 million, along with his savings and a year of free rent in one of his homes. Who had more reason to want Bill gone? Yet for all the suspicion, the case stalled. Nanette was charged with theft and served a short sentence, but no one was charged with the killing itself. The murder slipped into the cold files, where it sat for nearly 15 years. What finally broke it open was a fresh set of eyes. In 2008, a cold case investigator named Larry Montgomery revisited the file and tracked down a former fitness trainer who confirmed that Nanette and Eric had been romantically involved long before Bill's death. An old anonymous tip resurfaced, in which a caller had warned that a neighbor, Naposki, wanted Bill dead. The pieces that had been scattered for years began to fit together. There was another problem for Naposki. He had no firm alibi for the night of the killing, and he had insisted he never owned a gun like the one used. That denial collapsed when investigators tied him to exactly that type of weapon, a 9mm handgun. On the night Bill died, Naposki said he had been working a security job nearby, but the timeline left room for him to slip away and return. In 2009, both Nanette and Eric were arrested, 15 years after Bill died. They were tried separately. In 2011, a jury convicted Eric Naposki of first-degree murder, finding that he had personally fired the shots and done so for financial gain, and adding years to his term for using a gun. The following year, Nanette was convicted as well. Both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So who was the man behind the trigger? Eric Naposki had once seemed destined for a different life, a powerful athlete with a professional career behind him. By the time of the killing, that career had faded, and he had grown close to a woman whose access to a fortune offered a way back to the comfort he had lost. He has never admitted guilt, and from prison he has continued to insist he was not the killer, pointing instead at others. Nanette, for her part, had built much of her life around access to wealthy men, and Bill McLaughlin's fortune had been the largest within her reach. The money she moved through forged checks, dated so close to his death, became some of the strongest evidence against her. Both remain in California prisons, he in the desert and she in a women's facility in the central part of the state, each still denying any role in a killing the courts decided they had planned together. Their appeals have gone nowhere. The next case moved south to Beverly Hills, where a death first looked like nothing more than a terrible accident. Daniel Jacoby. In October of 2017, a wealthy widow named Violet Jacoby was found dead at the bottom of the grand staircase inside her mansion on North Roxbury Drive in Beverly Hills. Her children had gone to check on her after she stopped answering her phone, and it was they who discovered her body on the marble floor. At first, it looked like a tragic accident, an older woman who had fallen on the marble steps of her own home. Her death was initially treated as a fall, and nothing about the scene immediately suggested a crime. Her estate was worth around $12 million, and her husband, a doctor, had died only about a year earlier, leaving Violet with the family wealth. But the autopsy raised questions a simple fall could not answer. Doctors found small burst blood vessels around her eyes, a sign that pointed not to a tumble down the stairs, but to strangulation. Violet, 67, had not died by accident. Someone had taken her life and tried to disguise it as one. For a time, the case had nearly slipped away as an accident, and only the medical findings pulled it back. The coroner ruled the death a homicide caused by pressure to the neck, not a fall. Attention turned toward her own family. Her son, Daniel Jacoby, a dentist, stood to inherit half of her fortune. He was described at first as cooperative, but investigators said his account shifted as they pressed him. He denied being at his mother's home the day she died, yet surveillance footage placed the white Jaguar he drove in her neighborhood that very day, contradicting what he had told detectives. Why would a grieving son need to lie about where he had been? The most damaging evidence came from his own devices. In the weeks before Violet's death, someone had searched a disturbing list of terms, including how to crack a neck, questions about chokeholds, about whether a chokehold leaves a mark, about deaths caused by choking, and about how to search the internet privately. Read together, the searches looked less like idle curiosity and more like preparation. Daniel was arrested about 4 months after his mother's death, in early 2018, and charged with first-degree murder, with the added allegation that he had killed for financial gain. He was denied bail and would remain in custody for the entire span of the case. Then the case slowed to a crawl. Years of delays followed, driven by the slow pace of the courts and the complexity of the evidence. And Daniel sat behind bars for more than 7 years before he ever faced a jury. His trial finally opened in the summer of 2025. Prosecutors argued that he had strangled his mother with his own hands to claim his inheritance, calling it an intensely personal kind of killing. The defense countered that her injuries were consistent with a fall, and that he had not been desperate for money, noting that he had recently secured a sizable loan for his dental practice. The jury did not accept it. In August of 2025, Daniel Jacobi was convicted of first-degree murder, with the financial gain allegation found true after the jury deliberated only briefly. In October of that year, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He took the stand at his own sentencing and insisted he was innocent, telling the court that his mother's death had been an accident and that he was not a criminal. The judge was unmoved, pointing to greed as the force behind the killing. Who was Daniel Jacobi before all this? He was a professional man, a dentist who ran his own practice in a nearby community, the kind of person neighbors would never have suspected. That ordinary surface was part of what made the case so unsettling. Behind it, prosecutors said, was a man who had researched how to take a life, carried it out against his own mother, and then tried to pass it off as a fall on the stairs. Daniel Jacobi continues to maintain his innocence from prison, where his sentence offers no path to release. The fortune his mother left behind, meant to pass quietly to her children, had instead become the motive that sent her son away for life. The next case began with a delivery at the front door on the morning of a court date. James Sullivan. On a January morning in 1987, a man arrived at a fashionable townhouse in the Buckhead district of Atlanta, carrying a long box of pink roses. The woman inside, Lida McClinton Sullivan, opened her door expecting a delivery. Instead, she was shot and killed on her own doorstep. The flowers were a disguise, and the timing was no accident. The hearing that morning could have forced Sullivan to surrender a large share of his fortune. Lida died on the very morning a hearing in her contentious divorce was scheduled, a case that could have cost Sullivan millions. Lida was 35, the daughter of a prominent Atlanta family, her mother later a Georgia state legislator, and she was in the middle of separating from her husband, James Vincent Sullivan, a wealthy businessman who had built his life on a liquor distribution company inherited from a relative, and who had since moved to a mansion in Palm Beach, Florida, where he had remarried and built a new life. The divorce threatened to cost him a great deal of money, and investigators came to believe he had arranged to have his wife killed rather than pay. But believing it and proving it were two very different things. Sullivan had paid a hired killer to carry out the act, a man who posed as the flower delivery man at her door. The hired man, later identified as Philip Anthony Harwood, was paid $25,000 for the killing. For years, though, the case against Sullivan would not hold. A civil court had already found him responsible, ordering him to pay $4 million in a wrongful death suit brought by Lida's family. Yet when he was tried in federal court in the early 1990s, he walked free. To many, it seemed he had escaped justice, shielded by money and the distance he kept from the killing itself. For years he lived openly and comfortably, seemingly untouchable. What changed? The break came when the hired man's former girlfriend came forward with what she knew, finally giving investigators the testimony they had long been missing. Phone records and money trails helped connect Sullivan to the man who pulled the trigger. In 1998, Sullivan was charged with murder. But rather than face a courtroom, he ran. Sullivan became an international fugitive, using his wealth to move from one country to the next. He passed through Costa Rica and Panama before settling in Thailand, spending heavily to stay hidden and far from the Atlanta courtrooms that wanted him. For 4 years he stayed ahead of the law. His face was eventually featured on a national crime program, and a tip led authorities to him. In 2002, he was tracked down in a seaside town in Thailand, living with a companion and taken into custody. After a fight over extradition that stretched on for years, he was returned to Georgia to answer for Lida's death at last. In 2006, nearly 20 years after the Roses arrived at her door, James Sullivan was convicted of murder. The jury chose not to impose a death sentence, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The man who had used his fortune to buy a killing, an acquittal, and years of freedom abroad had finally run out of places to run. Who was the man at the center of it? Sullivan had climbed into real wealth through inheritance and business, and had built a comfortable life far from where he started. When his marriage to Lida threatened that wealth, prosecutors said he treated her life as a cost to be cut rather than a settlement to be paid. The man he hired later pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, admitted his role, and was released after serving roughly 2 decades. Lida's parents spent decades watching the man they believed responsible avoid the consequences. First through an acquittal, then through flight to the other side of the world. Their long refusal to let the case fade through years of dead ends and a husband who seemed untouchable was part of what kept it alive until the day a jury finally held him accountable. Sullivan, now elderly, remains behind bars in a Georgia prison, where his sentence leaves no path to release, and his appeals have failed. The next case unfolded on a holiday afternoon inside a family that seemed to have everything. Dana Ewell. On Easter Sunday in 1992, a successful family was found shot to death inside their home in Fresno, California. Dale Ewell, a businessman who had built his fortune selling aircraft and operating mobile home parks, was shot in the garage of the family home as he returned from a flight in his own plane. Inside the house, his wife Glee and their daughter Tiffany, a recent college graduate, had also been killed, all by a gunman who had lain in the wait inside the home for them to return. The family's estate was worth around $8 million. On the surface, it looked like the sudden destruction of a family that had everything. The killings came on a holiday, when the family had expected to be together, and at first there seemed to be no clear motive at all. One member of that family was not at home. Dana Ewell, the couple's son and a student at Santa Clara University, had an alibi that placed him far from the scene. At the time of the killings, he was with his girlfriend, whose father happened to be an FBI agent, a detail that made his account seem all the more solid. At first, he appeared to be the lone survivor of an unthinkable loss. But something about him unsettled investigators. He showed little grief, and he moved quickly to take control of the estate, speaking of the family fortune in a way that struck investigators as cold. To outsiders, he was the surviving son. To detectives, he was becoming something else. Could a son really orchestrate the deaths of his own parents and sister? That was exactly the theory that took shape. Detectives came to believe that Dana had masterminded the killings to inherit the family fortune, and that he had recruited a friend from Santa Clara, Joel Radovchich, to be the gunman while he kept himself far away, building the clean alibi he thought would protect him. The investigation was slow and meticulous, stretching across several years and led by a detective named John Souza, who would not let it go. For a time, Dana lived freely on the strength of his alibi, even as the detectives quietly built their case. Investigators traced a pattern of unusual spending, including expensive helicopter lessons billed at hundreds of dollars an hour that Dana was quietly funding for Radovchich, and a careful arrangement the two young men had used to communicate through numeric pagers and payphones, swapping coded messages designed to leave as little trace as possible. The two had also spent freely in the months around the killings, a pattern hard to square with ordinary grief. The most important thread led to the weapon. A specialty 9mm rifle linked to the killings was traced to an associate of Radovchich named Ernest Jack Ponce, who agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity and testified about how the plan had come together. A relative of Radovchich also came forward, helping investigators understand how the two had pulled it off. Piece by piece, the picture of a grieving son gave way to that of a planner. Dana and Radovchich were arrested in the mid-1990s, and in 1998, after a long trial, both were convicted of first-degree murder. When the jury could not agree on a death sentence, both men were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So what kind of person plans such a thing? Dana Ewell was 21, articulate and ambitious, raised in comfort and pointed toward a business career. Prosecutors described a man who did not want to wait for an inheritance he believed was already his, and who was willing to erase his entire family to claim it sooner. He had cast himself as the heartbroken survivor, even as the evidence showed he had engineered the loss. From prison, Dana has maintained his innocence and has spoken of a religious conversion in the years since. Joel Radovchich, the gunman who carried out the killings Dana is said to have planned, is also serving life in prison without parole, held at a separate facility. The fortune Dana schemed to control slipped entirely out of his hands, lost to the very crime he built to seize it. The final case belongs to an heir whose fortune followed him through decades of unanswered questions. Robert Durst. Few names in American real estate carried as much weight as Durst. Robert Durst was the eldest son of a New York real estate dynasty, the family behind a company that controlled some of Manhattan's most valuable skyscrapers. His father had built that empire, and the family fortune was estimated near $100 million. He also left behind a trail of death that followed him for decades, and for years his money and his name kept the hardest questions at bay. It began in 1982, when his first wife, Kathy Durst, a medical student in her late 20s, vanished after a weekend at the couple's country home north of New York City. She was never found. Robert was the last known person to see her, and suspicion lingered for years, but without a body, the case went nowhere. Kathy's family never stopped believing he knew what had happened to her. Then, in December of 2000, his close friend Susan Berman, a writer and the daughter of a notorious Las Vegas casino figure, was found shot to death in her Los Angeles home. Berman had acted as a kind of spokeswoman for Robert during the original investigation into Kathy's disappearance, and authorities believed she may have known the truth. She was killed not long before she was due to speak with investigators again. She had been shot once in the back of the head, with no sign of forced entry. She was killed just as investigators were turning their attention back to the old case. Was it a coincidence that she died the moment she became a risk? The following year, the story grew stranger still. While living in Galveston, Texas, disguised to avoid notice, Robert killed his neighbor, Morris Black, and disposed of the remains in Galveston Bay. He had been living under a false identity at the time, hiding from the renewed attention on Kathy's case. He was caught, but in a remarkable trial in 2003, a jury acquitted him, accepting his claim that the death had come during a struggle. He served time only for lesser offenses tied to the cover-up. Once again, the heir walked away, the verdict stunning observers who had followed the case. How does a man linked to 3 deaths stay free for so long? Part of the answer was wealth, which bought him the finest lawyers and the ability to disappear. But in 2015, an HBO documentary series called The Jinx revisited the entire saga, laying the 3 cases side by side for a national audience and drawing millions of viewers. During filming, Robert was confronted with damaging evidence. Later, wearing a microphone he appeared to forget was still recording, he muttered to himself, in the privacy of a bathroom he did not realize was wired, that he had killed them all. The moment became one of the most talked about in the history of true crime television. Robert Durst was arrested in 2015 in a New Orleans hotel on the eve of the documentary's final episode. He was found with a revolver, a large amount of cash, and a false identification. In 2021, after years of legal battles in a Los Angeles courtroom, he was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Susan Berman and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Weeks after that conviction, he was also charged at last in connection with the disappearance of his first wife, Kathy. The question that had shadowed him for nearly 40 years, though he would never stand trial for it. He never faced that final reckoning. In January of 2022, only months after his conviction, Robert Durst died in custody at the age of 78 after going into cardiac arrest at a prison medical facility. Because his appeal was still pending, his conviction was formally set aside under the law, and the charge involving Kathy was rendered moot by his death. Who was Robert Durst beneath the fortune? He was an heir who had every advantage and used them to stay a step ahead. A man whose wealth allowed him to vanish, to hire the best defense, and to outlast one investigation after another. For decades, the money and the family name held the questions at arm's length. In the end, it was the recordings, the documentary, and the patience of those who refused to let the cases die that brought him to a prison cell, where he spent his final months. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.